Okay, I'm going to be talking about your final paper and assigning it properly right now so that we have more time in class to talk about the books. And there's nothing interesting that you don't already know that is required for the paper. It's the same as what's been on Canvas. So I'm going to walk you through it. And then if you have questions, we'll talk about those in class. Now I have to find out how to share the right screen, or rather find the right screen. Which you should be seeing now, but which I still cannot see. Okay, so the general guidelines for the paper are that you must advance an argumentative interpretation of at least one text we read this term. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by argumentative in just a second, but generally what that means is that you need to not just summarize or observe or even analyze, but you need to give me a reading of at least one of the texts. And then second on here, that argument needs to refer in some larger way to questions we've discussed over the term. So constructions of femininity, the virgin whore dichotomy, the development of the novel, 18th century notions of sex or sexuality, the difference between ignorance and innocence, definitions of virtue, constructions of masculinity. Any of those would be examples of larger theoretical questions that we explored. And the argument you make about a book needs to connect to one of those issues. And there's lots more. So those were just the ones that occurred to me right now. Okay, 3. Your final paper must incorporate in some meaningful way at least 3 secondary sources from your own research or the annotated bibliography. And I've mentioned this before, but you're reading articles that are, I hope, interesting to you. And so those might be really helpful, but at the end of term, before you have to write a draft, you'll have a whole database of summaries of articles about all of the books. So let's say that you're sure you want to write on Shyamala or Evelina. You can go in and search for the articles on Evelina and then look at the titles and the summaries to see whether any of them will be helpful for you. And then those articles will be in the Google Drive folder. So you'll know already what the argument is, and you'll have the article all ready for you to look at. That means that you should have a very easy time finding at least 3 sources to use for any argument you wanted to come up with. If you've looked at the annotated bibliography recently, you'll notice that it's really comprehensive already. Okay. Your paper should be between 8 and 10 pages long, exclusive of bibliography, appendices, and notes. 8 and 10 pages is considerably shorter than what I would normally assign for a 300 level class. And I'm doing it because the whole term is bananas. And I want you to feel a little bit less pressure. But at the same time, to my mind, that might make it a lot harder to write because you have to get these ideas that you have about the text and the larger theoretical questions really tightly organized in order to fit them into this page limit. Okay. Exclusive of bibliography, appendices, and notes. The bibliography, that means the works cited page. Appendices, it would be hard to imagine you using unless you were writing, say, about Fanny Hill or Pamela or any of the other books and you wanted to find your own illustrations. But if you were including illustrations that I sent you from those books, that would count as an appendix, for example. Notes would be if you chose to include footnotes or endnotes, which you don't need to do. Everything you should must follow eighth not 18th century, edition MLA guidelines for formatting and citing. You've been doing that already with your bibliography, and you need to do it also with your actual final paper, which means the margins have to be right. I want you to use Times New Roman 12, 1-inch margins, page numbers with your last name on the top, right-hand side of the page. Make sure the headers look right. I care about all that stuff, or rather, I really notice when it's not done properly, and you don't want me to be noticing the formatting when I'm starting to read your paper. Okay, papers will be graded according to the grading criteria, which I'll talk about in just a second. Before I talk about the grading criteria, let me talk about the conference. And you're not required to have a Zoom conference with me. However, I strongly encourage you to have one with me before the draft is due. That way we can make sure that the argument you're working on is sound, that the text and research you found fit together in the way that you need them to, that if you have two different things you're thinking about working on, we can pick one that it turns out might work better, or any other host of reasons to come talk to me during my office hours or whenever. I can meet almost anytime. So I would like you to do that. The more prepared you are for the conference, the better I can help. The closer your conference is to the draft's due date, the more coherent your work should be. You don't have to have anything ready when you come talk to me, but if the draft is due tomorrow and you come talk to me today, we're going to have a very different conversation than if you've already written a few pages about what you think. And that could even just be free writing. Okay, the draft, I'll just go over this really quickly. I'll just go over this part really quickly. The draft has to be at least 4 pages, but shoot for 5 to 7. I wrote that before I reduced the number of pages for the final paper. So it must be at least 4, but shoot maybe for 4 to 6. It can include outlines of how you analyze examples or use sources. It doesn't have to look like a final paper. It does need to be intelligible to other people. So I can look at it, or your group can look at it and understand exactly where you're going, even if you don't have everything written out into paragraphs yet. It might include quotations, and then you might have bullet points for what you plan to say about the quotations, for example. That's totally fine. You need to include at least 2 secondary sources, not the 3 that your final paper will need. And what we're mostly interested in when we look at a draft is how to make the argument stronger. So we care less about the prose, for example, or about transitions. What we care about is how to make the argument a better argument, which will take me back to the grading criteria, which I have pulled up already somewhere right here. The grading criteria are the same criteria I use for every class, and you'll notice again that it's a 100-point scale. And these are sort of broken down according to how many points I award, but it's a little bit hard. I mean, these are almost approximate, although I think the rubric follows them precisely. The main reason it's hard for me to say that it follows the rubric exactly is that if your argument sucks, everything else can be perfect, but your paper is still going to get a really bad grade. If your argument is brilliant and everything else is mediocre, you might get a much better grade. And that's because the strength of the argument is really determining the level at which your paper can the grade at which your paper might receive. So the argument is worth 35 points, but it's also foundational. Does the paper have one controlling argument that is both strong and specific? Strong means, does it engage with the entirety of, does it engage with larger theoretical questions that we've been discussing? Is it specific enough? Does it include close readings, for example? Has the writer read the text well and produced a sophisticated argument in response? Does the argument relate to larger questions? When I say thesis, or if someone else says thesis, I want you to know that it's not thesis statement necessarily, but that it's the argument that the thesis statement expresses. Okay, so I care a lot about your thesis. I'm less fixated on the sentence or two or more that might actually describe what your argument is. Analysis of evidence and organization are really hard for me to separate, so I've got them both at 20 points. Analysis of evidence includes what we would call close readings, compelling evidence, not just close readings, but also logically showing me how your argument is the best interpretation of the text or the issue. If you consider counter arguments, that will only make your paper stronger, what someone who disagreed with you would say, and then how you would respond. Okay, it'll be impossible to analyze evidence well if your argument is not effective. Organization. Does the paper make it easy for the reader to follow the argument? Does every point build on previous points as the paper proves the thesis? Is it organized according to the argument and not the chronology or the characters? It bugs me when papers begin with, at the beginning of the novel, and then in the middle, closer to the end, at the conclusion. That seems like a weird way to organize a paper, when I would expect you to pull out, instead of organizing it according to your ideas and then pulling out the scenes or quotations that are relevant as your ideas require them, instead of trying to fit your ideas into the organization of the novel itself. Impossible to organize your paper well if your argument is not effective. We're going to talk more about the structure of a paper before your paper is due, not right now, closer to when your draft is due. Clarity and style. I would like your paper to be clear and easy to read. There should be transitions everywhere. Do you move slowly enough so that I can follow you, so that I don't have to do a lot of my own work in the analysis? Especially, I would like your style to clarify rather than obscure meaning. So good writing takes complicated ideas and makes them easier to understand. Bad writing takes simple ideas and makes them very hard to understand. You want to do the first one. Mechanics, proofread the damn paper, basically. Learn grammar. Okay, I can help you with all of these things, and I will, and I'm eager to, especially in our Zoom conference. Okay, and we can talk, of course, before your draft is due, but then also between the draft workshop and your final paper. You'll have plenty of time there as well. All right, so I'm going to consider this assigned, and then you will let me know if you have other questions in class the next time I see you, and I will try to remember to ask every class if other questions have come up. Okay, good. I will see you soon, and I hope you're really excited to write.